Hello, and welcome to Cutting Through. I'm Mitchell Plitnick. The latest of President Donald Trump's various rants and raves um, is has turned his attention back to NATO and his anger at NATO allies for not joining and supporting the United States in this illegal, reckless, and stupid war against Iran. The uh, the issue of his inability to reflect on the fact that the entire alliance's refusal to help might be an indication that he shouldn't have started this war in the first place. That does not occur to him. But now he is once again threatening to leave NATO, something that, frankly, it came up in his first term as well, and seems like something that he would like to do. I think he does not see any use for NATO, and would like to leave it. Now, I have to say, I'm going to put this in there. I certainly don't view NATO as Donald Trump views NATO, but I also uh, do think that NATO is a Cold War relic and should be relegated to the same dustbin of history that the Cold War resides in now. I don't find NATO to be useful. I think NATO has a number of drawbacks to it. The Article 5 issue is one that I think we can debate, but many people believe that it is the reason that certain European states and members of NATO have never been attacked. I do not agree with that view, and think it particularly questionable on many levels. But it complicates matters in a number of ways. And I think more than anything else, what bothers me about NATO is the requirement that countries spend a certain amount of money on defense, whether or not they would really want to spend that much on weaponry in their budget. And of course, that comes back to the global arms trade, which the United States is obviously a major player in. Even corporations in Europe that manufacture arms are often in partnership or partially owned by Americans. So, the support in the United States for NATO comes in many ways just from the desire to sell more and more expensive weaponry. I don't think that should be encouraged. I think the argument that NATO's disappearance would suddenly lead to a free-for-all and leave countries very vulnerable, I think is false. I think countries would still make bilateral or even multilateral defense agreements. We're seeing countries do that are not in NATO. It's not unusual, and I think that is probably a better way for things to work, where each individual country manages its own defense and sets its own priorities. Be that as it may, the question I want to address here is, can Trump simply decide to leave NATO? It sounds like when we hear the conversation that it's just a simple matter of leaving NATO. He decides and we leave. And until a few years ago, that probably was the case, although it hadn't come up in the real world. But in 2023, with Joe Biden in office, the national the annual defense budget, the NDAA, featured an amendment that said that two thirds of the Senate must agree for any president to pull the United States out of NATO. So you'd basically need the same majority that you need to ratify a treaty. Uh, that is an interesting provision, and it's an important one because it certainly does complicate matters for Trump. He will not be able to simply snap his fingers and pull us out of NATO. The Constitution gives the president the power of treaties. It's very explicit in the Constitution that the president negotiates treaties with the advice and consent of the Senate. That's where the two-thirds of the Senate majority rule for treaties comes from. But the Constitution doesn't say anything about pulling out of treaties. So I think certainly the argument is would be from not just Trump. I think almost any president, who are presidents are always looking to expand their power. This is a rare case where, because Joe Biden was very committed to NATO and understood the threat, not just from Trump, but from Republicans and Republican isolationism in general, that they would might want to pull out of NATO. He was very supportive of this law. So it's an unusual example of a president being supportive of limiting his own power. But of course, it was in a way that Biden himself and anyone who thinks like him would never have used. So what did it really matter? But in general, presidents would argue against limiting their own power and would argue that since the Constitution doesn't say anything about it, that this is within their power, especially because it does say that treaties are in the president's domain. That basically the president is the boss of treaties, so it is implied that he could leave them. That would be the argument. If Trump decided to leave NATO, he would then, be challenged almost certainly, and the case would have to go to the Supreme Court, which would make the decision. I don't think it's a slam dunk that this court, as conservative and pro-Trump as it is, would necessarily support um, Trump's decision. This decision would be one that major corporate sectors of this country would be against, because for the very reason I mentioned earlier, because NATO essentially mandates a huge amount of spending on defense. And if you're going to spend on defense, even if you spend it domestically, you're probably in some way spending it in the United States. And certainly, if you decide that you want to get better weapons, you're going to be spending it in the United States. So there's a very clear stake for American lobbyists to oppose this, and those concerns are very significant to conservative justices on the court. So, at the same time, they are also, beholden to Trump and to that part of the Republican base. So, it's not a sure thing, is basically the point. And then, if the Supreme Court did decide that the president had that power, there would uh, did not require two-thirds of the Senate. And I guess I should throw in, I find it very unlikely that any president would ever get two-thirds of the Senate to agree to this. Then uh, NATO's charter requires 1 year notice, so it would be another year before the United States would actually be able to leave. Um, Now, all that being said, the real question isn't so much whether Trump has the power and the authority to leave NATO, to pull the U.S. out. It's really much more Trump's commitment to NATO. And will the United States, for example, just reduce its presence in NATO, reduce the number of troops it contributes to NATO? If Trump does that, he doesn't necessarily have to pull the U.S. out of NATO. It would erode NATO and would lead NATO to a collapse. Listen, I think that between Russia and Ukraine and the whole situation now in the Middle East on many levels, NATO has shown itself to be kind of a paper tiger in many ways. Um, so I think in many ways we could argue that NATO is dying on its own. As I said before, will not be sad to see it go. I know there are many, even many on the progressive left, who think NATO is a good idea. Um, Okay, and we can have that conversation, but the question that I think we're looking at here is, will NATO survive? And it can't survive without an American commitment, and certainly Trump will pull that commitment back. Um, we saw with Joe Biden that the response from the Democrats is to renew the commitment and even double down on it. Um, and we'll see. In my view, that was one of the reasons that there was no way to head off the Russian invasion of Ukraine. But that's a completely different argument and story that I have to get to another time. Uh, but I don't know that at this point, if Trump really kind of pulls the U.S. out of NATO in practice rather than in actual fact. And he keeps the U.S. membership, but just reduces U.S. participation. Um, which I don't see how you can argue that he can't do that. Um, then I think it will be very, very hard to repair that damage, even if the next president is very committed to NATO. Um, so I did think it's important, though, just for people to know that it isn't quite so simple as Trump is making it out to be, that he just decides, as of course he always believes, that, he as president, he can decide anything he wants. But there is this pesky thing called the Constitution that he does, that he does have to, on some level, deal with, as much as he hates it. So I did think it was important that people know that he can't just snap his fingers and pull the U.S. out of NATO. So I'm going to have more to say in the next few days about the situation now in Iran. There's a lot going on. I have several articles coming out that I'm going to be happy to share with folks. But until then, if you can like, share, support this channel, if you can donate to keep this work going, that is going to be deeply, deeply appreciated, especially in these very difficult times. I like to think that I'm providing you something that you're not getting elsewhere. So if you can help, please do. And we will be talking again soon.